the implications of these sanctions that have been announced?
Yeah, it can turn out to be a rather complicated situation. At the moment, it's a bit speculative what the specific implications are. Some economists say it might cost Russia up to 1.5% of GDP per annum at the moment. They might even slip back into recession. On the other hand, there are also implications for the EU side, for the European side. So sanctions are not for free. So both sides are making some sacrifices here.
So is this pressure from the West more so that they struck the first blow? We saw at the beginning of the year when there was a crisis in Crimea that the US actually sanctioned some of the individuals in Russia. And now the second phase this week when President Obama made the announcement again. Yeah,
sadly so. I mean, we could observe an escalation of not only rhetoric but now also action militarily, but also now on the sanction side. And you pointed out that there is a kind of division between the EU on the one hand and then the US on the other. But we have to distinguish the two a little bit. You know, the EU is a group of countries, 28 countries. They have different interests. Some are heavily dependent on Russian energy supplies, sometimes up to 100%. Other countries are smaller, others are bigger, whereas the US is further away, and they are basically energy independent. So there are different stakes involved here at the same time. So that might explain why the US is pushing further ahead much quicker than the European Union is at the moment.
So let's look at the business interest of Russia in other smaller countries, especially the former USSR countries. The banks there are operating there, and if sanctions are imposed, there wouldn't be any backlash there, would there?
I think, but this is hard to say. I think for Russia, the former Soviet Union countries are less important than the international capital markets at the moment. I've seen numbers that up to 50% of the bond market, when that Russia is borrowing actually internationally, if that dries out, then that can be problematic for the country and for the banking sector to recapitalize at the moment. Don't forget, you know, Europe is still on a rather shaky ground in terms of banking capitalization and so on. So the crisis as such is not completely over.
Recently, when the G20 summit was held, we saw Russia being sidelined. But in the meantime, with the same token, we saw German Chancellor Angela Merkel holding discussions on the sidelines of the G20 summit. What could they be discussing at the moment?
Maybe not so much the G20. I mean, Russia is still part of the G20, but it was then expelled from the G8, which is now the G7 in the end. You know, I think most politicians have an interest not really to escalate the conflict further, and therefore you need to talk to one another. And I think Germany is in a key position that on the one hand is willing to implement some sanctions, but rather not to try to escalate the situation. Because the problem is really, you know, if you keep on escalating things, then at one point, of course, it becomes more expensive for everyone. And how do you scale down then in the end? So it's very targeted, it's step by step.
But Russia seems not bothered about this sanction announcement.
Not that much on the on the surface, but I mean, the economic implications are pretty clear cut. So the sanctions are not for free.
All right. Before you go, let's talk about Russia's position in terms of retaliating, because they are heavily dependent on Russia's energy supplies, especially gas.
Yeah. You know, my argument is always that there's a dual dependency between Western Europe or Eastern Europe and Russia. And I think that makes the situation more complex. I mean, Russia is also dependent on selling oil and gas. You cannot simply say, no, we don't supply anything, because then you don't get any revenue. On the other hand, there are European countries, EU countries, that are up to 100% energy dependent on imports, and they come from Russia.
Right.
So that's actually a nice situation where the two sides have to come together and hammer out a deal.
All right. Thank you so much for talking to us. And by the way, I have to mention this one. He's flying straight from Germany, straight to us to